Let's get into it now. A spoiler-free movie review of Drive Away Dolls. This movie was the palate cleanser that I needed. And we're in a weird time for movies right now. January, February, we're still in the dump months. We're about to get into March with Dune coming out. But this is kind of the movie I needed right now. A movie I didn't really need to think a whole lot about. A movie that was under 90. It was only an hour and 16 minutes from start to finish, at least up until the credits. And a movie I didn't have to think a whole lot about. A movie that was very self-aware and in on the joke. So all those things combined together, and also that I didn't really know entirely what I was getting into before going in to see this, I think that led me to really enjoy this movie. I will say right at the top, this movie is not for everybody. Drive Away Dolls is a very hard R movie. A lot of graphic scenes, obviously a lot of language and violence. But I think at the core of this movie, it has a lot of heart. It has some good intention. So even myself, I don't think I was the primary demographic for this movie. And looking at the people in the theater when we went to go watch this, I just found it interesting how everybody took in this movie, which I'll get into more. But what the movie is about, you have two girls who go on a last minute trip to Tallahassee. Margaret Qualley plays a girl named Jamie, who is this really free spirit from Texas. She talks with a southern accent. And me being from Texas, I always find it funny how somebody chooses to take on a Texas accent because they always turn it up to a 10. But I think in the case of this movie, it actually played into it really well. You also have her friend in the movie is named Marion, who is this very uptight person who is trying to find somebody just to hook up with. And that is really the entire plot line of this film. It kind of has that classic dynamic of the odd couple, one being very uptight and serious, likes to read, likes to go home and go to sleep on time, and the other one being the more wild person who can just go into a bar, meet somebody, and take them home. Where the action takes place is on their trip to Tallahassee. They are taking a drive-away car, which is a car you take from one location to another, and although the movie never really says when it takes place, it has a feeling of like the late 70s, early 80s, where something like this was a little bit more common. So they go to rent a car to drive it to Tallahassee, and at the same time, there are these criminals who have contacted the same place and said, hey, we're going to send a person to pick up a car to take it to Tallahassee because it has to be there tonight, and these criminals have placed something inside the car that they don't really say what it is, but it's very incriminating and very important that it gets to Tallahassee on time. The girls show up right after that guy gets that phone call, so he thinks, oh, this has to be the people they sent. So a classic mix-up case, and the movie is very wacky like this. It kind of reminds me of the plot line in Blank Check, wherever they're going to send somebody to pick up the $1 million check. Preston Waters happens to go in because he was given a blank check. He decides to write it in for $1 million. He shows up at the right time, and they're like, oh, they sent a kid to cash the $1 million check. They give him the money, and then the criminal shows up right after him, and they're like, we just gave the money to the kid. So nothing novel here in the premise, but in the storytelling here, it works because it's very animated storytelling. It kind of reminded me a little bit of Scott Pilgrim, mixed with like Road Trip, mixed with a little bit of female Dumb and Dumber. They kind of have that dynamic, even though neither of them are dumb. I think just the fact that it's a road trip movie, one of them is a little bit more reckless and one of them is a little bit more by the book, also kind of reminded me of Jeff Daniels in Something Wild. I just love road trip movies, and this one really reminded me of a movie that probably would have come out in the late 90s and early 2000s. And this would have been a movie that would have had so much success then because it had that kind of feeling to me of this is a movie that I would have loved to have discovered when I was younger, probably like 13, 14, where I probably should not have been watching R-rated movies. But at that time, I did. I think we probably all did. And this film has that feeling of if it were on a VHS tape, it would be the movie passed around among friends. It kind of has that cult classic vibe of like a Super Troopers that nobody saw it in theaters really, but everybody saw it on a VHS tape that just got passed around and passed around. Nobody ever bought a copy, but somehow we all watch these types of movies. So that makes me excited knowing that movies like this are being made. Even though the financial ramifications of this movie aren't great, probably cost about $20 million to make, and opening weekend only made $2.5 million. Again, it is a weird time for movies right now. Not a whole lot of people motivated to get out into the theaters, but I think if it came out at a different time, or even if it went straight to streaming, probably more people would have seen it. And the movie has a great director, Ethan Coen, who he normally does movies with his brother. You're probably familiar with the Coen brothers. They've done movies like Raising Arizona, The Big Lebowski, Burn After Reading, my favorite, No Country for Old Men. And this is the first movie that Ethan has done without his brother. And the movie's not the biggest departure from the types of films that they do. It still has that comedic element to it, but it's a little bit more experimental in some of the storytelling aspects. It is very cartoonish, but on purpose, very campy. And I think going into it, I was expecting something a little bit different, a little bit more grounded, but the movie really doesn't take place in our reality. I don't necessarily love movies that are just fun for the sake of being fun. That is all fine if I'm watching a movie for free, but if it's a movie that I'm going to the theater to watch and pay money for, I don't really just want to watch something ridiculously fun and leave like, well, that was a fun old time. But in this case, the things that helped it were the fact that Margaret Qualley was really good. Her character was very well written, and she also showed how much of a range she has because she is an actress that I really loved in Maid, which was much more of a dramatic role. She's also been in movies like Poor Things, and it was cool to see her in a leading role and really show how much comedic timing she has. But this movie allowed me to see a different side of her, and I was really impressed by that. Her and Geraldine Viswanathan had amazing chemistry, and that is really what was the driving force in this movie. You also had Beanie Feldstein, who was a supporting actor in this, and she played a cop. And I already know her work from Booksmart and her other films, how much great comedic timing she has. I won't say she stole the show from the other actors, but without her, the movie would have had a little bit of a lull. But she was definitely that something extra that the movie needed to carry it along, which is interesting because, like I said, the movie is under an hour and 20 minutes. So there's really just nonstop action. But in moments, it felt like they ran out of footage because they did these little sequences in between that were almost like that 70s show transition things where they have all the characters spinning around and little groovy kind of visual effects. And some of those went on a little bit too long. That's where they play some other actor cameos in between. It almost felt like they were trying to stretch it out a little bit. And that's what kind of made me feel like they almost didn't have enough story or maybe ran out of money to make the movie they wanted to make. Which leads me to my biggest criticism with this movie. And again, I still found the movie entertaining. It was fun. I was in and out of there, so I never really had time to not enjoy the movie. As a matter of fact, at one point I had to use the restroom and I didn't leave because I didn't want to miss anything. But after all was said and done, I thought to myself, what was the purpose of this movie? I just needed one thing to be the takeaway from the film, whether it be just a comment on friendship, some kind of storyline that went along that made me think, oh, this is why I should tell people to go check out this movie. But the entire story was really just set up to make one joke. But the problem with that, if you end up not finding that joke funny, you really will have a hard time enjoying this movie. And I can tell it was kind of going for a modern day Thelma and Louise with a heavy hand on the R rating and the raunchiness. Even though I know I'm not the key demographic for this movie, I still found myself laughing out loud at times. But there's almost a point in the movie where it makes you feel as the viewer that the joke is on you. Like you decided to go see this movie and now we're going to shove cake in your face. But overall, for Drive Away Dolls, I give it 3.5 out of 5 road trips.